Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you today. I'm really excited for this conversation. Um, Peace, Eric. Good to see you. Take a minute and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Share the link, share the video with friends, send it out to on social media or you know share it over email. And if you appreciate what we do, then share it with folks afterwards. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion today. So I'll say quickly, like, our guest is somebody I met just, what is it, a week, 2 weeks ago now, almost. Yeah, we're about 2 weeks ago now, at the Archives Unbound conference, the Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson conference at UC Santa Barbara, which I was invited out for. And so met this scholar there. They were a part of the organizing and the hosting of that event. And I was just talking to him at one point and said, "Hey, what do you work on?" And said Palestine and settler colonialism. And so, anyways, I looked up one of his papers later on and saw that he had written this really great piece about Malcolm X and Malcolm X's pro-Palestinian politics, and it really breaks down a lot of things. So we'll get into it. I'm happy to do this. So I'm just gonna do a quick introduction. So Hams Hamzah Baig is a Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at University of California, Santa Barbara. Received his Ph.D. in history from Yale University in 2023. Bridging Middle East and African history, his dissertation explores questions of revolutionary movement building, Afro-Asian solidarity, settler colonialism, and post-colonial state formation through the Algerian Revolution and its global reverberations, which I'm definitely interested in talking about that too. So perhaps we'll do another conversation about that in the future. Um, Hamza, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's good to be with you.
Good to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, right on. So I know I read out a little bit of an intro, but is there anything else that you kind of want to say? Just introduce yourself and your work to our audience before we get into this discussion.
Sure. You kind of went over the main points, but yeah, I primarily work on anti-colonialism, decolonization, intellectual and political history, revolutionary networks with an emphasis, like geographical emphasis on the Middle East and Africa. My dissertation was on Algeria, the revolution, its kind of afterlife, through its kind of linkages and connections to um, within the kind of third world political scene, specifically movements that are facing settler colonies. So Palestine and Southern Africa end up being really key kind of linkages and points of reference in the project. So yeah, I I think that's about all.
Awesome. Well, that's great. So let's start with, we're gonna get into this piece that you wrote. Um, and I should say, first of all, it's in the show description. So, and it is a free PDF download. So I recommend people just grab it so that they can reference it and read it themselves, because it's really great work. And I'm sure we won't touch on everything, but I wanted to start kind of with the historical context of Malcolm X, because we do hear these discussions sometimes about, oh, like Martin Luther King had a bad line at a certain point on Zionism, or Du Bois has been a subject sometimes for the piece that he wrote in, I think, 48. And like, these are it's easy to kind of look at that and say, oh, they took a bad stance, but also you kind of situate it within a broader context, within movements and aspects of the black radical tradition in the first half of the 20th century and into into the 50s and early 60s, right? And you know um could you give some context, as you do in the piece, to the relationship between some of these various Black radical figures from the first half of the 20th century and into the 60s with Zionism? What was this affinity based on, and what were some of the expressions of it that you noted?
Yeah. So historically, it's the case that most African American intellectuals and activists identified not with Palestinian anti-colonialism, but with Zionism, right, as a political project for land and self-sovereignty. And this has a lot to do with the long history of European anti-Semitism in the late 19th century, with pogroms in Imperial Russia, all the way through to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and across German-occupied territories during the Second World War. And the group itself was very heterogeneous, so included liberals, moderates, radicals, with varying kind of motivations for the identification with political Zionism. It's impossible to get into each one, but so I'll try to touch on a few examples. And of course, as I note in the piece, the group includes A. Philip Randolph, MLK, W.E.B. Du Bois, among others. And at different points, all of whom made parallels between Zionist nationalism and Black struggles for self-determination. And particularly after World War II, you see a rise in support for political Zionism. It's really as Black intellectuals are drawing connections between anti-Semitism and white supremacy. So Du Bois is, as you mentioned, is always the one of the off-cited figures. And Du Bois did link political Zionism and Pan-Africanism, embracing a kind of like myth of a Zionist anti-colonial uprising at the very end of the Mandate period against the British in the 1940s. Right? He had also been very interested in early 20th century Jewish agricultural settlements and the Zionist labor movement. So for him, Zionist labor policy and the kind of influence of different Marxist theorists in Russia and Germany on various members of either the Zionist labor movement or later the kind of with the turn to German-inspired cooperative settlements, these end up being for Du Bois for a time, at least until 1956 when he has a very stark and definitive break with Zionism, influential and significant, right? And this is a very much a failure to see Zionism as a colonial project and Israel as a settler colonial state. And it goes to show that everyone had their blind spots and inconsistencies, right? So Du Bois famously wrote this piece in the Chicago Star in 1948, where he reproduced well-worn kind of Orientalist tropes around anti-modern and backwards Muslim Arab peoples, while the kind of European Jewish settler population is represented as harbingers of modernity and civilization. And he had nothing to say really about how the formation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine entailed the ethnic cleansing of over 750,000 Palestinians and the destruction of some 500 towns and villages during the 1948 Palestine War. Though later, as I mentioned, he ends up breaking with Zionism in the wake of the 1956 Suez War, which we can also talk about. Another thing, so on this, what's interesting and something I don't really touch on in the piece due to kind of limitations of space is that Zionist leaders make a concerted effort to tie the founding of Israel to African decolonization and third world liberation struggles, right? In the 1950s and early 1960s, Palestinian, as well as various Algerian, Egyptian intellectuals, activists, representatives, were trying to lobby among leaders across sub-Saharan Africa for political support. And this is to mixed success, right? So Israel cultivated strong relationships with multiple African states following its exclusion from the 1955 Asian African Conference at Bandung, beginning with Ghana in 1957. So the Israeli government offered loans and generous trade agreements, sent technical advisors to help Ghana's construction, public works, and transportation sectors, and oversaw the establishment of a joint shipping venture between the Ghanaian government and the Israeli shipping company Zim. It's really after, so throughout the 50s is, I would say the lowest point in terms of lobbying for support, and really after the Algerian Revolution, when at this point, alongside Cairo, Algiers also becomes a key center for South-South kind of intercolonial exchange. And in both places, in Cairo and Algiers, Palestine is a constant topic of conversation. right? So Arab intellectuals are consistently speaking to the influence of Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company and Paul Kruger on Theodor Herzl, who's the founder of political Zionism. But at the time, many leaders were unwilling to see parallels among settler colonies in Africa, right? Including Algeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, and Palestine. And there were several reasons for this, right? So first is the Israeli Foreign Ministry spent immense resources on a propaganda campaign to disassociate Zionism from colonialism and cultivate the country's image as a symbol of anti-colonial and anti-imperial triumph, right? The product, this idea of a kind of narrative is the product of um, a nationalist movement born from racist and religious persecution, right? And that secures independence against British imperialism. And prominent South African-born Zionists like Arthur Goldrich, who served in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War as a member of the Haganah, the Yishuv military force, took active roles in the anti-apartheid movement. So this is also in part why figures like Nelson Mandela were initially reading and influenced by Zionist literature, alongside works on guerrilla warfare in Algeria, Cuba, and Vietnam. So for instance, in the early 1960s, while Mandela was underground evading the security branch in Johannesburg, he was reading Menachem Begin's memoir, The Revolt, right, which is about the Irgun paramilitary force in Palestine. And he saw it as an effective example of urban guerrilla insurgency for MK, Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the African National Congress's military wing. And of course, Mandela also later revises his opinion and becomes a proponent for Palestinian liberation. Yeah, but the last thing I wanted to just mention on this was, and it's impossible to get into all the details, but it is important to know, just from my own research for the dissertation and independent like articles, I did find that at the same time that this is happening, especially amongst like the leadership, the plenty of like rank and file militants and intellectuals who have very different kinds of conversations. So you find a lot of rank and file militants in the ZAPU and Zimbabwe African People's Union, Frelimo of Mozambique, Angolan MPLA, and other groups who embrace Palestine as a fraternal cause. And this is in the early 60s, before the 67 war and what the kind of the shift that comes after that, right? Often through personal exchanges. And Malcolm X was part of this kind of more radical third worldist current that rejected the Zionist narrative. Yeah.
Thank you for all that context. Appreciate it. So one of the things that you talk about in this piece, and we'll go back because there's a lot of elements of this. I mean, there's elements of the NOI that are important to talk about in this discussion and all kinds of things. But one of the really important pieces that you're looking at in, or one of the really important experiences that Malcolm X has that you're looking at in your piece is his trip to his trip, right? Folks are familiar with the trip towards the end of his life that is part of after he has left the Nation of Islam. And he comes back from this as folks who kind of follow his political trajectory with a more full out, kind of anti-colonial, pan-African, um, internationalists. He always had elements of this, but it's more fleshed out, I think. And in that trip, he goes to Egypt for a while, right? So he's obviously influenced by Nasser and the project going on in Egypt. But as a part of that, he also takes a trip up to Gaza to visit Khan Yunis. And, at that time, he's there, 64, right? And, or is it 60, 64? Yeah. And, they had a significant massacre in 1956, right? And so say a little bit about kind of who that he met with and some of the things that might have influenced him there at the time in terms of personal experience.
Yeah, sure. So the trip to Gaza comes as part of his extended stay in Africa and West Asia in 1964, as you mentioned, right? So in early September of that year, in 64, he left for a pretty brief it's a two-day visit to Palestine. At the time, Gaza Strip is under Egyptian administration, which allowed access and freer movement, right, within the region. So Malcolm visits the refugee camp at Khan Yunis in a local hospital. In the afternoon, he meets with Ghazan religious leaders and local officials. And then he also sits with a Ghazan poet, Harun Hashim Rashid, who I would say is, I mean, from the way it comes across in the diaries, in Malcolm X's travel diaries, that meeting was very significant and had left the most kind of stark impression on him. So he sits with Rashid and listens to his story of escape from Khan Yunis in November 1956 during the Suez War, which was triggered by Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal Company when British, French, and Israeli forces attacked the Sinai Peninsula. And it was during the Suez Crisis when the Israeli military invaded southern Gaza and killed Palestinians at Khan Yunis, Rafah, and the village of Kafr Qasim. And so many Palestinians were killed in their homes and at the camp. Others were lined up in the city's central square and shot en masse. Right? In total, Israeli forces killed some 275 unarmed civilians. And following the attack, a curfew prohibited immediate burial. And Rashid's recollection of the massacre left as I said, a really, really deep impression on Malcolm. And in the coming weeks, it served undoubtedly as one of the primary sources of inspiration behind his anti-Zionist discourse, alongside other conversations that he's having. And in the Malcolm X's Tribal Diaries, which are held as part of the archival collection at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, which was donated to the center in the early 2000s, I believe. The Travel Diaries include a poem written by Rashid, which he wrote down and copied into the diary on the subject of return. And in Palestinian literature as well, like Rashid is, I think, best known for his poetry on the theme of return for Palestinian refugees in exile. And it's one of the poems, and I reproduced that poem in the piece. It's a very short piece. Yeah, and so for Malcolm, the meeting in Gaza is important. And then right after he gets back to Cairo, he also meets with Ahmed Shuqairi, who's the president of the newly formed Palestine Liberation Organization. And he meets a number of Palestinians, some of whom go unnamed in the diaries. But what's clear is in the immediate wake of the trip to Gaza, is that Palestine is consistently emerging as a kind of topic of personal and public conversation. Right, and all of this informs the piece that he writes for the Egyptian Gazette, a few weeks later.
Right on. Thank you. So say a little bit more, about this. Let's get into the piece, right, that he wrote then when he's in Egypt. And if you want to offer more too about his time there, the influence of Nasser on him, and how you think he understood Zionism through a lens of settler colonialism, the role of which, as you point out in the piece, the role of which he saw as to drive a wedge between Asian and African solidarity. So say a little bit more about his analysis and what he wrote in that piece.
Sure. Yeah, so I can talk a bit about this time in Egypt, and then I can get into the piece. So in many ways, Cairo becomes a kind of home base for Malcolm, where he spent a lot of time during his travels in '64. And at this point, as we noted, by the early 1960s, it's really a sense here for South-South connections and anti-colonial revolutionary networks, right? So many different movements are setting up offices. And it's significant in that sense for all the different interactions that are enabled by its transformation into a kind of revolutionary city, right? So Egypt's participation in the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference and the nationalization of the Suez Canal raises the President Gamal Abdel Nasser's kind of international profile, makes him a central figure in the first wave of post-colonial nationalists, what's referred to often as the Bandung generation, right? And so the regime under Nasser devotes sizable resources to making Cairo a kind of locus for liberation movements from across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And later Algiers, also Accra, Dar es Salaam, you have a lot, the end of a kind of network of like revolutionary cities become really critical. So specifically in Cairo, what's important for Malcolm is the Pan-African aspect, as well as, of course, the linkages that are made across the African-Asian divide and thinking through and wider networks, Latin America. But I think there are two kind of important aspects of this that stood out to me in terms of like probably what attracted Malcolm to Cairo. One was the African Association, which is housing the offices for several revolutionary movements. It's founded in 1955, and it ends up housing many movements of sub-Saharan Africa, students and exiles who set up shop there, and intellectuals come through. So it's a really important space. Another is, of course, with January 1958, there's the opening of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Committee's permanent office, secretariat there. So Cairo enables Malcolm, among other kind of Black American radicals, intellectuals, to establish close transnational political and intellectual relationships, right? And to frame the US Black freedom struggle in global terms. And then specifically on Nasser, so Malcolm was deeply influenced by Nasser's political speeches in the regime's large-scale projects. So it started with a land reform measure that aimed to destabilize the monarchy-era ruling class and redirect its capital into industrial development, right? The notion of popular sovereignty was particularly influential. And this was part of a wider trend that Malcolm encountered during his days in the Nation of Islam, right? The NOI's official news organ, which we talk about also, Muhammad Speaks, routinely featured stories on Egypt's nationalization of large-scale industry, foreign trade, banks, public utilities, and the kind of development of the agrarian reform program. So at the same time, something, again, I think it's important to note the kind of blind spots that come out of this as well, right? There are many contradictions and inconsistencies with regard to Egypt's domestic and foreign policies. I'll touch on just a few of those examples here. So, which Malcolm and the NOI more broadly overlooked, right? One is that the scope of these projects, like the land reform program, did not really empower landless peasants and unorganized workers, as was often touted by the regime. There's also the regime's violent suppression of numerous Marxists and communists, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, right? In addition, Radio Cairo has gotten a lot of attention in recent years by scholars and people interested in the kind of history of Cairo as a revolutionary city. And Radio Cairo being a kind of important avenue for revolutionaries to run their shortwave radio broadcasts, such as Voice of Free Africa, Voice of Free Algeria, the Swahili language broadcast, Sotia Cairo, Voice of Cairo, which called for opposition to British and US imperialism and helped further kind of anti-imperialist sentiments in East Africa, right? In one instance, there's been some really good work on that. By the 1960s, these transmissions would extend to 30 African languages, a significant program, right? And with a far reach. But ironically, this took place during the same period in which Nasser signed the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement, whereby Egypt secured access to 87% of the waters of the Nile River to the detriment of bordering East African countries, right? And the construction, as well, there's also the construction of the Aswan High Dam and Lake Nasser as part of the large public scale works project, which results in the forced resettlement of some 50,000 indigenous Nubians from their ancestral lands. And of course, then the legacy of the trans-Saharan slave trade and anti-Black racism in North Africa, which numerous Black students and exiles routinely spoke on and encountered, right? So these complexities should increasingly figure in our understanding of this moment, right? There's a lot more to say on how Nasserists and other Arab nationalists held on to this kind of Cold War inflected sentiment, that any reference to the legacy of the trans-Saharan or Indian Ocean slave trades was divisive and reactionary. And we could talk about that as well, but I just wanted to mention that. And then getting to the last part of your question, right, on how Malcolm understood Israel as a settler colonial state. So you're right, he's back in Cairo at the time, and he's meeting with not just different revolutionaries and intellectuals from across Africa, but also a lot of Black American expats, like Shirley Graham Du Bois and her son, David. who's a journalist for the Egyptian Gazette and the Middle East News and Features Agency. And he's also writing, also does pieces, works for the Egyptian Gazette. So he works on this, Malcolm works on this piece in September of 1964 titled Zionist Logic, right, for the Gazette. And David is one who encourages him to work on the piece and to get that in the paper. So the piece itself, right, Malcolm, and now it's become very off-sided. And he kind of condemns Zionism as a new form of colonialism, right? Argues that Israel, with its position as a settlement colony in the Eastern Mediterranean, was, quote, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers, end quote. Right? And he also denounced the Israeli government's economic aid to newly independent African states as a form of neocolonialism, arguing that Israel was an outgrowth of European imperial expansion. Israelis and European imperialists were closely aligned, and Israel's investments in newly independent African nations effectively served imperial interests. And Malcolm's diary entries elaborate a bit more on the terms through which he understood Jewish settlement in Palestine, right? Essentially through settler colonialism as a global formation. So in what one kind of page I'll talk about. So there's actually something very interesting. Maybe about 10 years back, the diaries were published. And then there's an injunction to stop, but they were published by the Shabbat's family. And you won't, what's not in there though, is a lot of kind of scribblings and handwritten notes and things for speeches that Malcolm's giving, outlines for, you know, like this essay. That stuff is not there. That you could for a time find the travel diaries, right? But what's at the Schomburg is kind of the work in progress aspects of kind of what, for instance, Zionist logic, but also speeches, things that he's working through, ideas, conversations that he's having. So, in what reads as like a bare bones kind of sketch of the essay of Zionist logic, for instance, he likens the Israeli-Palestinian relationship to that of white settlers in the US and native peoples, or colonialism in South Africa, right? He writes, quote, Arabs indigenous to Palestine and Israelis from Europe. His conclusion, Zionism equals racism. And then the essay in Zionist logic, he writes on some of this, and then he kind of ends the essay, concludes by taking aim at Israel's ethical religious kind of pretext for colonial settlement as a return to the homeland. Right, that's his kind of parting thoughts. You know.
Appreciate that. Actually, a little earlier on when I looked a little bit spaced out, it was because I went briefly down a little rabbit hole of looking at the diaries as you were talking about them. And I mean, it's funny too, because we had a conversation with her Boyd at one point, who was part of the publication of that, has a relationship with Malcolm's daughter and the family, you know, and but there was this lawsuit to, like, you know, if you want to get it now, it's like $300 to get a physical copy or whatever, because it's just like, I guess they've stopped the print run of it at least. Um, and yeah, but it's interesting too, even in the publication of it, the things that would be left out. And I know we'll kind of get into some of this as we go on, but you know, the ways that Malcolm's legacy and his political thought are kind of polished around certain points that people want to kind of, you know, remove or not bring too much attention to or something, you know, is an interesting thing. I mean, that's, you know, I have a live reinvention behind me, you know, but yeah, I mean, that was we talked about, we'll talk about Manning Marable a little bit, and Alex Haley as well as we get into this, I think, a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And obviously, I mean, I understand that, you know, for things like notes and marginalia, like there are other reasons why those might not make it into a book. But yeah, this legacy is still like very contested space, as a lot of people have done work on, and folks like Jared Ball at I Mix What I Like, you know, have continued to kind of highlight some of the areas of analysis that are stripped out of a lot of treatments of Malcolm. So anyways, let's keep going. So On this topic, one of the things that you note is that Malcolm X's stances on Palestinian liberation and Zionist settler colonialism are completely left out of the autobiography, which of course was published after he passed. Alex Haley. It was always as told to Alex Haley, but there were obviously decisions that Alex Haley would have made and editors would have made that Malcolm wouldn't have had any input on. And also, these things are missing from the what is it? Manning Marable's uh, biography, which came out a few years back. I can't remember actually. A Life of Reinvention, right? That's what the original
Mhm.
title is. Um, and so you argue that both books are really antagonistic in their own ways to Malcolm's political philosophy, um, and you write, quote, accordingly, his relationship to Palestine and his political philosophy itself must be examined within and through the historical contexts and theoretical paradigms of Black radicalism, Third World anti-colonial struggle, and Islamic liberation theology, end quote. So you also talk about the study he undertook after he left the Nation of Islam and how this influenced him. So, can you talk a little bit about these elements, kind of what's left out of the most prominent biographical treatments of Malcolm X here? We could say the movie too, obviously, and how do you understand? How do you think about Malcolm X's political philosophy?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And you mentioned the film, right? The film is hmm, I think it's probably a film in conjunction with the autobiography that paints this kind of picture um, of Malcolm embracing a kind of in his post NOI, post Hajj, uh, moment in 64, late 64 into early 65 when he's assassinated, that he's kind of abandons race as an analytic, and it's really he embraces this kind of colorblind universal humanism, right? Very much the film, this readings of the film that come off that way, they really pare down the kind of radical internationalism that's animating his political philosophy, right? And a lot of the other literature out there in the mainstream presents this kind of circumscribed picture of Malcolm that focuses also on the individual without situating him in a collective context and a global context. Both of those things, right? It's um, so, I think when I think about like the continuities, really it's from his earliest days in the NOI all the way through even when he leaves. He's the consistency is there, the kind of internationalism, looking to what's going on in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That's consistent, right? I would say, just it grows more increasingly internationalist all the way through until when he's assassinated, right? He's envisioning a kind of upsurge that dismantles the restraints of American civic virtue and racial liberalism, right? So consistently looking to, and like in Message to the Grassroots, one of the most kind of in '63, which he gives speech he gives in Detroit. Um, where he talks about Bandung, he talks about the bloody hostile revolutions of Algeria, China, and Cuba, right? And it puts him really at odds with the mainstream civil rights movement establishment. And during and after this time, and really, in the NOI and after it, he saw Black mobilization in the United States as part of a kind of global rebellion against white supremacy and imperialism, right? What he called a tidal wave of color, right? From his early days in the NOI while incarcerated at the Norfolk Prison Colony, through his appointment as Minister of Harlem's Temple Number 7, right? So he's invoking Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in '52, the Viet Minh victory against the French military in 1954, the Algerian Revolution, all as kind of durable symbols of political awakening. And he believed that third world national liberation movements were the most pressing analogs for Black liberation in the US. Here, Black people constituted a kind of decentralized colony and were struggling against labor exploitation, racialized violence, and occupation, like their counterparts in the global South, right? And this theory, it has a long history. So it retools an older internal colony model made popular at the Communist International Sixth Congress in 1928, which argues which argued that the Black communities in the Black Belt counties of the U.S. South were an oppressed nation with the right to self-determination. Now, following Malcolm's split from the nation in March of 1964, yeah, he spends a combined 6 months abroad, 2 trips in 64. And this radical internationalist framework, again, endured, and it only deepens, right? He became, I would say, just more of an internationalist due to the extended contact that he has with a bevy of revolutionaries, intellectuals. And another crucial aspect at this point in time was a further leftward turn. So his increasing commitment to socialism and critique of capitalism become more and more apparent, right? And again, this is due to many conversations and independent reading. So Malcolm's reaching for a kind of more historical materialist critique of white supremacy and imperial subjection that foregrounds worldwide movements for popular sovereignty, right? And for him, Palestine fits neatly into this third worldist frame of analysis. And what ends up being, I think, what ends up becoming clear from looking at the diaries and also looking at some of the speeches and from his time there that are published in like local press, whether it's in Ghana or in Egypt or in Lebanon, let's say, is that he's having he's having a lot of conversations all the time, talking to people, different intellectuals, representatives of movements. That ends up informing the way he's thinking, very much so. And another thing is he's reading. Like I mentioned, like he's a voracious reader, so he's reading whatever he can get his hands on, and that's again bringing him to embrace this kind of third world, this political perspective more and more. And the revolutionary kind of armed struggle aspect is something that's increasingly relevant. Though, and it's very strange. Still very strange to me that there are readings that assume the opposite. You know, yeah.
What do you mean by that? Readings that assume the opposite?
Well, just the mainstream kind of representation that pares down all of this, right? I think Gerald Horne had a really great kind of takedown of the film of Spike Lee's 1992 film, which was co-written by Arnold Pearl, where he kind of takes him to task for really leaving out all of this kind of Black internationalism that's animating Malcolm's social thought at the time, and also the collective context is really important, right? Like I said, it's not happening in a vacuum. So the people he's engaging with, talking to, he's always interested in movements. He's interested in what's going on in collective spaces. It's really always about what people are doing as, as part of an organization, part of a collective. It's really not the way it's often represented as these kind of individualist terms. Yeah, well, I guess in the mainstream, I think plenty of people who have read, there's also a lot of good literature out there, who have read the right stuff, in my opinion. Again, that's just my perspective. You know, have it, yeah, or maybe would reject that. So
yeah, right on. So let's see. I'm trying to think which one I want to go to next. I actually want to go. I'm going to go to the NOI next, and then ask the question sort of about influences and some of the contacts he had, and some of the further spread of this thought. Because obviously, part of what we want to do, and you piece lays this out, right, is sort of talk like there's sort of the various currents that are going into Malcolm and his thought, and then there's also kind of the currents that come afterward, and how much they're sort of influenced by him and some of his peers. And so, we'll go to that next, but I do want to talk a little bit about the NOI, because I don't think that often the NOI doesn't get very serious intellectual engagement in terms of these issues. Sometimes they're often painted as an anti-Semitic organization, right? Quite bluntly, and certainly we can find instances of that from figures within the NOI. But there is also what was going on within Malcolm Speaks, and I know that you mentioned some of his work in the piece. His book's behind me, but Garrett Felber, who also has done some work on Malcolm and wrote the book Those Who Know Don't Say, does look at this, does think about, like, anti-Zionism within the NOI and the role of the NOI in kind of developing a Black radical anti-Zionist critique. And so, how much thinking do you think the NOI had on his thinking here? Obviously, you've already, or sorry, how much influence? You've already laid out the inner, all of these other aspects of the context, which I think are critically important to kind of how radical and internationalist and third worldist it is. But when you go back and look at issues of the Malcolm speaks of Muhammad speaks from the period, you can see that there is also an attention to third world movements, to internationalism, and so on. So yeah, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So Muhammad speaks. Yeah, so definitely in terms of like cultural production, newspapers, the Muhammad Speaks and other like publications that are coming out of the NOI are really important, and that provides one of the best windows into the kind of political scene and what folks are interested in, what is animating, the kind of thought around where they see the Black freedom struggle in the U.S. in relationship to what's going on in the global South. And Muhammad Speaks very much inaugurates this kind of style in placing stories of anti-racist mobilization in the U.S. alongside and in conversation with developments in Sudan, developments in Algeria, Egypt, the Congo, right, South Africa. It's really and that influences later generations. So yeah, we can talk about that as well. And it's that space, and Malcolm works as part of the editorial staff that Muhammad Speaks. So he's also influenced to this particular current within the NY that's very deliberately thinking about these connections. Um, and Garrett Felder's book, yeah, I think it really clearly outlines this kind of the development of NOI. The NOI stands on Zionism and what that means for Black Power activists later, right? And what he says is a kind of litmus test by which Black Power activists will be measured on international affairs. Um, and it is very much the case because you have one is also uh, Muhammad Speaks featuring interviews and pieces by not just like students from the nation who are like going to study in Egypt and so on and so forth, but also pieces written by Palestinian Muslims who are teaching at NOI schools, right? Teaching Arabic or Islamic studies or different things at NOI schools in Chicago. And there's a couple who I mentioned in the piece is Jamil Shafik Diab and Ali Baghdadi, Palestinians who also feature as journalists writing pieces for Muhammad Speaks. So definitely you have that element, right, on the NOI and thinking through those connections because it's either folks who are, again, Palestinians who are in direct conversation and contact, and therefore you have that avenue, and also with various NOI members going abroad for studies or for attending conferences and reporting on conferences. You have that, right? So a big moment I remember that's covered in NOI publications is the 1957 Afro-Asian People Solidarity Conference in Cairo. And that's really significant. It's significant for many different, I mean, a lot of, for its kind of afterlife and what that means for APSO and its formation, but also in some of the linkages that are established between revolutionary networks in and out of Cairo and in Detroit, Chicago, New York, NY kind of headquarters and other main offices. So yeah, for sure, I would say the NOI ends up creating and cultivating this really important space and touches on Palestine again before anyone else is in the left wing press in the U.S. or other Black publications. So from that perspective, it's really significant. And Malcolm, I think again, situating it as part of the kind of collective, and he's part of that conversation. but it's happening in a very much a kind of conversation amongst many, many people. Um, One of whom is Ethel Miner, who I mentioned in the piece, who's ends up being communications director for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but is initially in the NOI. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah, and
just
that's good.
about the full
I
circle.
yeah, I do want to go into Ethel a little bit, and talk about some of that, these other figures. So, um, it's important to say, like, this his stances, he takes he writes that piece in Egypt in 64, right? After 67, you see more people and, organizations starting to raise this question, to talk about it. You could talk about, obviously, SNCC, which is one of the prime examples, and I'm sure we'll talk about Kwame Ture a little bit. Um, but there's also, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers starts writing pieces, about this too, and around the same time, and other organizations. The Panthers also become, start to cover the PLO and develop relationships there, right? So, I'm curious, like, how much influence do you think his stance, or he had? Maybe it's really hard to gauge. Obviously, the article itself is written in an Egyptian paper, so it wouldn't have been something probably that most people would have gotten access to. But he would have also brought these politics into the organizations that he was developing at the time. And even though they're short lived, organizations like the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAAU. It included folks like Sekou Odinga, Herman Ferguson, Rosemary Mealy. I don't know if Max Stanford, also Dr. now known as Dr. Muhammad Ahmed, I don't remember if he was actually in that organization, but he definitely had a relationship with Malcolm at the time. Um, Ethel Miner, obviously, has this relationship with the nation and a close relationship with Malcolm. Um, and then figures like Yuri Kochiyama as well. And they all kind of carry forward traditions of this. So I'm interested in how much you think, um, how, I guess one way to put this question is, like, maybe there's a narrative that 67 becomes the kind of the genesis of the solidarity, and maybe what your work shows is that it's already there, but then it's like an event um that leads to the publication, or the taking of more position. So how do you see that phenomenon and these kind of relationships?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that was when I was doing research for this piece, it was really interesting to me how important intergenerational networks ended up becoming uh, on this kind of topic of Palestine. And so, yeah, Malcolm X's kind of stance on Palestine is prescient in a lot of ways, and I think certainly influenced other activists and organizers. So I interviewed Mohammed Ahmed a few years ago, um, and his time as national field chair for RAM, for the Revolutionary Action Movement, was certainly informed uh, in great part by Malcolm's Third World Revolutionary Nationalism, one that looked to Palestine and Algeria as key reference, right? Um, and Malcolm did make some public references to Palestine stateside as well, and so I'm sure it was a topic of discussion within the OAAU. Um, and then, yeah, as you mentioned, Ethel Miner. So uh, Miner, Miner is really interesting in a lot of ways, because she's credited for a number of things. One is, so she was a former member of the Nation of Islam, who was very close to Malcolm X. Later became communications director for SNCC, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then organized a study group on Palestine after Malcolm X's assassination in 65, February of 65. Um, and this was one that SNCC chair Kwame Ture, at the time Stokely Carmichael, participated in, right? Um, and I think that's where you see when looking at these kind of networks and exchanges, you see the intergenerational aspect. You see Malcolm, you see earlier figures and what that meant. What did it mean for the nation to identify with Egyptian anti-imperialism, and then of which the Palestine question was central, right? So as I note in the piece, it was really that larger kind of infrastructure and political space of the NOI that cultivated this anti-Zionist perspective. And Muhammad Speaks, it conveys its orientation in similar terms, right? Placing these kind of local national stories alongside stories of developments in the third world and alongside the conversation with anti-colonial movements and armed struggles. So the kind of focused attention to the Arabic-speaking world and Palestine in particular on the part of the NOI was significant because it introduced new ideological frameworks to an audience that extends really far beyond its membership, right? So by the early 1960s, the organization is already running one of the highest circulating Black newspapers in the country. So Kwame Ture later credits Muhammad Speaks as his first news source on Palestine, right? Quote, he says, it was the early 60s before I encountered in the pages of Muhammad Speaks any discussion of Palestinian rights and resistance, right? Learning about the close military, economic, and political alliance between Israel and the apartheid regime in South Africa taught him an important lesson in colonial circuits of knowledge and power. Like these kind of stories were all featured in Muhammad Speaks and was touched on. So that ends up being, very crucial and minor than minors is significant for bridging, in a lot of ways, bridging the two kind of periods, right? One of the figures that's crucial in bridging the two periods, like this old left era kind of Black radicals to the kind of Black Power era activists around the question of Palestine, right? So really, it's in his memoirs that Kwame Ture, the Carmichael, really credits and writes that he owes his study of Zionism, the detailed study of Zionism, to Ethel Minor, right? So definitely Malcolm, and also members like Ethel Minor, right? Speaks to the wider political context of the NOI, which I think is interesting for the fact that they're also at a very early period touching on the South Africa connection with the apartheid regime, which ends up being an important point of reference after 1967. So earlier period, a lot of the foundation for it is definitely with Malcolm and the NOI. I mean, I definitely see that because you see from just what people have, even like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and others talk about like having snippets and cut up like pieces of Muhammad Speaks and just working through that, right? Having that as reference points. And the fact that a lot of these folks were coming out of RAM, out of the Revolutionary Action Movement, makes sense given RAM's connection to Malcolm X. And so there's all these linkages that, and then the revolution, and then the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as well. There's so many connections there to RAM, and then also to Malcolm, given that Malcolm was always coming in and out of Detroit. And
to SNCC too,
yeah.
to SNCC too, because they end up getting
yes.
yeah.
So it's really, really interesting to see how these kind of conversations are happening. And then of course the kind of following the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, right, is the kind of high tide. You see what's often noted as the kind of Black American anti-Zionist organizing a rise in this, right? So its support for Palestine is on the rise. It coincides with increasing support for Palestine among liberation movements in Southern Africa, for instance, and as well as the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization is taking up the issue. So is an online movement, Organization of African Unity, as well. And more groups, more intellectuals are drawing consistencies between Jewish territorial expansion and nationalism in the apartheid system in South Africa. Right, and Israel is increasingly labeled as a counter-revolutionary force and channel for Western strategic interests in Africa in the late 1960s and early 1970s and on into the 80s. Right, so this is something that your listeners are probably familiar with, but of course, most famously, the Israeli military collaborated with the CIA and the South African Defense Force to arm and train the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, during the Angolan Civil War to counter the MPLA, Marxist-Leninist MPLA. And by 1979, Israel would be the apartheid regime's primary arms supplier, with 35% of its military exports going to South Africa. And during the same period, the Israelis supplied and offered licensing for the local production of Uzi submachine guns to the settler regime under Ian Smith in Zimbabwe, which became the standard in the Rhodesian armed forces and police, and used Israeli and US companies to transfer shipments of Bell 205 helicopters for use in counterinsurgency campaigns. So that whole, a lot of these things are anticipated, right, earlier. Yeah, pre-67. And that's elaborated later, so for sure.
Yeah, and we had a conversation with Alex Avinia like early on, after October 7th, some probably in November or something. And he talks about the all the history of this within Latin American movements too, of Zionists, collaboration with counterinsurgency regimes, far right regimes, even very anti-Semitic regimes too, that end up committing pogroms against Jewish people in South America too. So um yeah, well, I'll say quickly, I mean, there's a couple other threads we probably can pull on, but if folks do have questions, feel free to drop a couple in the chat. We have a little bit of time, so we can go into some other aspects of this if people want to. I do encourage folks to read the piece. I'm gonna bring up actually a comment a little bit earlier to see if you have some reflections or responses to this. Um, Nader says, I truly think Malcolm X's politics were years ahead of Nasser's. I wish Nasser had been influenced more by Malcolm's ideas. Obviously, this did flow in terms of, Malcolm's obviously influenced by Nasser, influenced by Bandung, which he, cites quite a bit. But what do you think about this in terms of Malcolm's political philosophy and ways that it might have differed from Nasser's?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I mean, it differs in a lot of ways. Um, or, I mean, it's hard to say what he would have made later, what happens after his death, Malcolm's death. But I mean, he never was, totally in on anyone. So he shared like, he wouldn't make these things public, but he had private criticisms of the regime, and some of the measures, right? Because he was also close to certain Muslim Brotherhood figures. So he was trying to balance this. And again, the kind of state centralization and the repression of like different oppositional groups was something definitely that, you know, he didn't vocalize. But again, because in the context in which he's operating, it's also U.S. racial liberalism, the Cold War. He's very much about like antagonizing the U.S. and he's just like fuck America. And it's that ends up being the kind of often the framework, right? So yeah, and I would say his political, yeah. I mean, his political philosophy was also around armed struggle, and Nasser. I mean, for all of the kind of rhetoric from the Revolutionary Command Council and Nasser around like support for armed struggles, it was a coup. It wasn't an armed struggle that led to it. So it wasn't necessarily like a bottom-up social and political revolution that led to Egypt, the 1952 independence of Egypt from King Farouk, Egyptian puppet. I mean, who was a British puppet, and the toppling of that regime in Egypt. So yeah, so for Malcolm, I think he was always most interested in bottom-up social and political revolutions. So I think, and that's the reason why I think he then also points more and more increasingly to Algeria, and he's looking at Kenya, Mau Mau, right? When he's always referencing, we need a Mau Mau, Mississippi. That becomes a very offsetting kind of quote. So for him, it's really he's thinking about things from in a collective sense and also bottom up kind of social and political revolutions, as opposed to the kind of, I mean, Algeria is another, but thinking about the revolution itself, and how that comes together and develops. So yeah, I mean, they differ in so many ways. So yeah.
Right on. I don't know if you have some responses to this, but wondering if you could speak at all to contemporary role of Zionism within Africa. Mentioned countries like Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, Congo, etc.
Yeah. So I haven't done much research on the kind of contemporary. Um, from what I mean, what has been the case in the recent past? Israel had, I mean, in Sudan, you could see Israel has had a role in counter-revolutionary. It's always had a role in kind of counter-revolutionary organizing, um, and in Sudan, there's been like a history of that. In the Congo, I wouldn't be surprised that in the recent past that it's had a role. So yeah, I can't speak to that in terms of right now at this moment. Um, but yeah, I want to actually look into this more. You might have something on this.
Not much, but I would, Leah, if you haven't checked it out, the conversation that we had, it's an audio one, but with the Kenya Organic Intellectuals Network, they do talk about it within Kenya, the role of political Zionism there, the role of Zionism in influencing the politics of churches of Christianity within Kenya, and also the kind of politics as their analysis of their own government, right, is that Kenya is a client state of imperialism, but that that both Israel and the United States are, and Britain, of course, still, UK, are kind of major nodes of that, and so yeah, I imagine there's the kind of what would you say, spectacular instances of it that we could point to, but there's also probably a lot in terms of the kind of mundane and everyday aspects of, you know, just trying to influence institutions, organizations, churches, politicians, you could think of it as lobbying, right, to a certain degree. But yeah. So anyway, not directly. So there was a couple questions here, and I don't know, again, like, this is probably outside of your study to some extent, but mainly the question seems to be about um, the NOI's shift. Like, so do they make a shift to be more comfortable with Zionism at a certain point? Have you tracked that at all with them organizationally? Just curious about that.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about this, and I might have read something on this a while ago. But so from what I understand, my readings, the NOI's position, especially in the recent past on Zionism, has been inconsistent. So depending on, even under Farrakhan, there's so many inconsistencies. And then under Weinstein, like the position, I don't know if the line ends up being kind of uh, firmly in the pro-Zionist kind of position, because you see uh, various speeches and things that are by not just Farrakhan but other like local leaders and different temples that have been very pro-Palestine. So again, the party line or the organizational line could differ from locality to locality. What I do know is that there, on the kind of national level, in the leadership, it's been inconsistent. That they're from even in the recent moment. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I think, was there anything else you wanted to say? I will, as your if you have any closing thoughts, I'll leave that open. But if folks do drop another question in the chat, then we can add into it. But yeah, was there anything else that you wanted to get to, maybe that we didn't cover in the piece, or just say, in kind of conclusion?
Anything else? I guess I would say that there's a lot of work to. I mean, there's on this topic of kind of like Afro-Arab solidarity in Palestine. There's a lot of really good work that's also being done. So I would encourage folks to There's more and more work being done that looks at this from the Palestinian angle. Um, Historian Maha Nasser has a piece in the Journal for Palestine Studies in 2019, I believe, and it's really, really important because there aren't many pieces that look at this. So it looks at the Palestinian engagement with the Black Freedom Movement prior to 1967. And it really draws on Arabic sources. And I'm working on an independent piece that looks at this from the perspective of like the PLO and other kind of Arab world revolutionary movements that are engaging with the Black freedom struggle. But there aren't really that many pieces out there that look at this from the other side, right? That draw on either French or Arabic language like sources and think about this from a perspective of like Algeria or Palestine, etc., and see how that's situated. So yeah, Mahanash's piece is really good because it looks at poetics and cultural production, folks like Mahmoud Darwish and how they were interested in the Black freedom struggle and how that informed their politics. So yeah, I would say that there's also a lot more to be said, and there's a lot of really great work being done. Yeah.
Right on. So yeah, somebody else had a good question. So early on in the live, we talked about, and you mentioned how, at a certain period, right, there was this alignment or this support or affinity, right, between Israel and anti-colonial movements, right, which also helps explain why folks like Garvey and Du Bois and others, would have been interested in it as a project. And here they're talking about Israeli aid to influence various groups of the Bandung generation. So, can you talk a little bit more about this? And I'm also curious if you have any thoughts on like what started the shift there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in terms of the influence or like the ties that are being cultivated, um, one, like I mentioned, the Ghanaian example is important, right? So George Padmore is a Trinidadian Marxist advisor for Kwame Nkrumah, was very much committed Zionist at the time, and that was part of the reason, not the only or primary reason for the development of this relationship, right? The relationship is also then based off of like who can offer better um trade agreements, a better package for economic. It really has to do with the kind of the material context of like who's offering better aid agreements between Egypt and Israel, for Nkrumah and for the government. Um, at the same time, and the ideological level, that is a big blow. The fact that Israel's excluded, and it's very alarming for many Israeli officials that they're excluded from Bandung, and that's when they kind of go on the offense to try to cultivate these relationships with various states. And and again, it ends up being successful in certain cases, like with Ghana, but also it's short-lived. So by even 63, 64, you're seeing a phasing out of this, right? Or even earlier, you see moments of like of dissension with other. So that relationship itself is not, especially amongst sub-Saharan like African states, is not something that's very long lasting. It's ephemeral, really, and it's even before 67 is what I'd say. You see an ebbing and flowing of this, and that has some of it to do with Algerian and Egyptian lobbying and the ways in which they're trying to, convince different leaders to back a kind of boycott and really phase out Israel from any kind in the diplomatic arena, the UN, and other like international forums. Um, yeah, so I would say it's partially that as well. And then you have in the 1970s the politics of oil becoming really important to this, and Algeria ends up having an outsized kind of role in convincing certain states, and then Gaddafi as well in Libya, convincing certain uh, governments to phase out and kind of break diplomatic ties with Israel. And 67 war, 73, so you have different moments in which these, more and more states and movements are turning away from any kind of connection to the Israeli government. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. I don't know what I want to say about this, but there's an interesting thing that happens between Israel and Ireland too. I mean, because also like I think so. You mentioned Menachem Begin like earlier on, and like he was also influenced by the IRA, and so there's like these weird, and there's also, I mean, within Irish history, there's all of this, there's all this mess, which just happens. This is part of the irony of colonialism in a certain way, and the material conditions of it as well. But like, um, you have instances where, the Irish are often a big part of the the British military, and also a part of the officer class, and are on horrible sides of a lot of um, decolonization efforts, right? In India, elsewhere, right, and end up committing massacres and things like this. And so, um, this is a there's a lot of sometimes romanticization of Irish solidarity with anti-colonial movements, which is a real thing. Like, I don't want to say that that doesn't exist, or that there aren't, um, isn't an affinity between a lot of Irish people and Irish organizations with anti-colonial movements. But there's also there's the loyalist aspect of it, of course, which has affinity with a lot of counter-revolutionaries. But there's also just, sometimes weird and bad positions. And I mean, even now we could talk about the way that Ireland is, situating itself basically vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, more so than, the actual, like, the resistance movements nowadays. And so, um, yeah, that's a messy topic, but I didn't know, I thought it was interesting what the point that you raised about, Menachem Begin also, um, you said influencing other folks, right, within the anti-colonial, sphere to some degree. And, again, like, this is complicated history, right? Because when you bring up this person's name to Palestinians, they'll be like, "This person is a horrible butcher," but there is this, and there is this history with Israel too uh, of people drawing upon their history of resistance against the British, I guess you could say, like a kind of settler revolutionary project. And this is kind of where I feel like the analysis of settler colonialism just wasn't as sharp. Um, at that period in time, and we have that now. So when we look back at these things, sometimes we're like, this is really weird. But there is a history um of solidarity or inspiration from settler revolutions as well, I guess you could say. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
Yeah,
that's my brain dump.
no, no, it's interesting because, I mean, I mean, yeah, the the ways in which Begin's like memoir influences like Mandela and other folks. Yeah, it's complicated. One is how much did he know about what was going on in Palestine in terms of the Arab population when the ethnic cleansing that happened, the Nakba, at this point in time, that is like the early 1960s. So there's that, and then the ways in which this is represented in the kind of broader political imagination, like the kind of Zionist Hotspur machine and the kind of foreign ministry playing up very particular narratives, right? But there's also like these ways in which, and again, for like an Algeria in the Algerian Revolutionary movement, they were looking to like Ireland, they were looking to Palestine, South Africa. But then in certain moments, and this is more in like the kind of realm of like diplomacy and things, that they cited the American Revolution as like an example. And how much that's actually, it's not, I mean, come on. But yeah, like how much settler revolutions can like influence or thinking about kind of like, because the way in which that's conjured, specifically on the British case, for folks in South Africa, for Mandela and other folks who were who are engaging with this, thinking about, okay, British imperial sovereignty in South Africa, and British settlers, English-speaking settlers in South Africa, and then um, the narrative, the Zionist narrative of a kind of paramilitary revolutionary uprising with guerrilla warfare at its center against like British targets, military targets, becomes like very attractive, right? And yeah, it's influential, and he didn't probably want to admit that later on at all, but it's there. Like it's that stuff is there. Those inconsistencies are there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think it also speaks to how um, kind of impressive Malcolm X's ability to sift through this and develop the line that he did in the period that he did. I mean, obviously, it speaks to organizations and the people that he was influenced by, learning from, study, right? But I think it's important to note that like there was a time when um, you know and I shouldn't say this as though we have some great clarity on it now everywhere, but I think that there is certainly more clarity among a much larger group of people around, Israel as a settler colonial project that has a genocidal kind of, history and current phase, right? That we're living through right now. Um, and of course solidarity to everybody in Palestine right now, and amid this, um but the there was this time at which there was a lot of lack of clarity. There was people feeling affinity and solidarity with on different issues around this, and in which the Palestinian narrative and story really wasn't being told or expressed by Palestinians. And I think that that connection is also critical too, as you point out in your piece, of the time that Malcolm spends in Gaza, and being able to really put these things together and develop a very kind of coherent response to it. And I think that that's I think it's also important as we look back at some of the missteps too of people from prior generations, of just understanding like how much confusion there really was at a certain point of time, even within very radical and revolutionary movements and organizations and individuals.
No, it's true. It's true. I mean, and you put it perfectly. Um, and I think with Malcolm, what's important are those the pairing of the kind of deep study of like the politics and history of the anti-colonial struggle in Palestine, with the kind of personal encounters that he has, and what that ends up being meaningful for him. That's not always, I mean, not to say that it's always necessary, but that does, for him, that ends up being very useful and important, um, and informs his analysis in critical ways. Because at that point in time, also, it's not like, it's not today where we have access to information and like a wealth of information at our fingertips. You know, it's not in the same that, I mean, it's not to say that that information wasn't available, because that's sometimes the arguments that are made. It's never to say that, because you do have information, but um, yeah, I think that is significant for sure, for sure.
Yeah. Right on. Well, thank you so much for this, Hamza. It's been great to be in conversation with you. I hope that we can do it again to discuss more of your work in the future. Yeah, I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Right on.
It's fun.
Folks, we'll be back next week. Have a conversation on Monday with Pramila Nadison to talk about her book, Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So, looking forward to that. And I'm sure we'll have more stuff coming next week as well. Thank you again.